I'm Josh Ryan, licensed professional counselor, and this is Pause and Respond, the framework for emotional control, disciplined thinking, and better decisions under pressure. How many conversations have you replayed that never actually happened? Not the conversation you had, the conversation your mind imagined afterwards. The one where you became convinced someone was disappointed in you, upset with you, judging you, maybe pulling away. It's remarkable how emotionally exhausted we can become by conversations that existed only inside our minds. Most of us spend far more time responding to our interpretations than we do to the reality itself. And that's what today's episode is about, because one of the greatest sources of emotional pain isn't always what people say, it's the meaning we quietly attach to what they say. Here's a sentence I hope you'll carry with you along after this episode is over. People rarely react to reality. They react to the meaning that they've attached to the reality. Those are two very different things. And learning to recognize the difference may be one of the most important emotional skills you'll ever develop. Imagine you're walking into work on Monday morning. You pass someone you've known for years. Now, normally, they smile when you pass them. Maybe they even stop for a quick conversation. Maybe they wave from across the hallway. But today, they walk right past you. You notice them. They notice you, or at least you think they do. Then they kept walking. 3 seconds, no words, no conflict. Nothing that anyone else would probably remember by lunchtime. But for the rest of the day, your attention keeps drifting back to that hallway. You replay the moment in meetings. You think about it while you're eating lunch. You find yourself wondering about it on that drive home. Thoughts like, did I do something? Are they upset with me? Maybe I offended them. I wonder what I said. One ordinary moment has quietly become an extraordinary amount of emotional energy. Now imagine something you didn't know. That coworker closes their office door and spends the next hour calling hospitals because their father was admitted overnight. Or maybe they were on their way to an emergency meeting. Maybe they simply just didn't see you. The story your mind created and the reality they were living never met, never crossed paths. Yet the emotions that you felt responded as though the story were true. And this happens because our brains are uncomfortable with unanswered questions. Human beings don't tolerate uncertainty very well. Our minds would rather have an explanation than an empty space, even if that explanation is wrong. Think about how often this happens. You send a text, hours pass, no response. Almost immediately, your mind begins filling in the silence. There's an assumption that they must be upset or that you've said too much. Maybe the thought is they don't want to talk to me anymore. What's interesting is how rarely our first explanation is generous. Very few of us naturally think they're probably in a meeting, they're driving, their phone may have died. Our minds often drift toward the explanation that confirms our deepest fear. Not because we're inherently negative people, but because uncertainty feels vulnerable, and vulnerability makes the nervous system start searching for answers. I've come to believe something after years of sitting with people in counseling. The brain hates blank spaces. Blank spaces feel unsafe, so your mind fills them, not with facts, but with familiar stories. And unfortunately, our familiar stories are often written by our oldest fears. That's why two people can experience the exact same event and leave with completely different emotional realities. One person may walk away thinking they're having a hard day. The other walked away convinced they don't respect me anymore. The event was identical. the meanings that were assigned to it were different. I call this the meaning gap. It's an invisible space between what happened and what you decided it meant. Every emotional reaction passes through this gap. It looks something like this. There's an event, we give it meaning, that meaning generates an emotion, and that emotion sends us into action. And that action or reaction affects the relationship. Most of us think emotions come directly from the events, but they don't. Meaning lives in the middle, and meaning is where emotions are born. I've watched this happen with couples sitting only a few feet apart. One partner quietly says, "You seem quiet tonight." The other immediately answers, "I'm not angry. Why do you always assume something's wrong?" But that wasn't the question. One person simply made an observation, while the other heard an accusation. Somewhere between the words that were spoken and the response that followed, an interpretation quietly slipped into the conversation. In our head, it sounds something like, "They think something is wrong with me." See, now the discussion changed before either person realized it. One was asking and reaching out for connection. The other was choosing to defend their identity. They weren't having the same conversation anymore. I've seen the same thing happen with leaders. A manager walks into a weekly meeting, the room is unusually quiet, people are tired after a demanding week. Nothing is inherently wrong, no one is upset, but the leader quietly decides they're disengaged. They're losing confidence in me. And that interpretation changes everything. Suddenly, the leader becomes more controlling, more defensive, more anxious, not because the employees themselves changed, but because the meaning that was assigned changed. And this is where identity quietly enters the story. The stories we create don't simply protect our emotions. They protect the identities we've built around ourselves. And if you've spent years quietly believing that you aren't enough, your mind will notice evidence supporting that belief long before it notices evidence against it. Not because it's honest, but because it's familiar. Our minds are remarkably loyal, even to stories that hurt us. Think about how many relationships had suffered, not because someone intended harm, but because someone misunderstood silence. Maybe they misread a facial expression or misinterpreted a delayed response. Maybe they assigned meaning to something that was never meant to carry that meaning. And sometimes, the greatest distance between two people isn't created by conflict. It's created by assumption. One of the most freeing discoveries you'll ever make is realizing this. Not everything your mind tells you deserves your immediate belief. Your thoughts are not facts. Your interpretations are not inherently reality. Feelings are not always accurate reflections of what's occurring around you. They're often accurate reflections of what your mind believes is happening around you. And that's an incredibly important distinction, because once you begin questioning the meaning, you can change the emotion. And once the emotion changes, the reaction often changes with it. Now, every emotional reaction begins with a story. And sometimes that story is true, but sometimes it's not. The challenge is that your nervous system responds to both true and untrue exactly the same way. And that's why learning to question your interpretation may be one of the greatest gifts you'll ever give your relationships. Because before you can change your reaction, you have to become aware of the story that created it. And that's exactly where we're headed. How do we learn to separate what actually happened from what we assumed it meant. Have you ever noticed how exhausting it is to spend an entire day reacting to something that never actually occurred? It may have been a look, a delayed text, an email with the sound of shortness, a conversation that ended a little bit differently than you expected. Nothing was confirmed. No one actually rejected you. No one clearly criticized you. No one even told you they were angry with you. Yet by bedtime, you've already lived through disappointment, embarrassment, conflict, and rejection, all inside your own mind. The suffering you felt was real. The event that created it often wasn't. One of the hardest things to accept about the human mind is your brain isn't always searching for truth. More often, it's searching for certainty. Think about how uncomfortable uncertainty feels. Waiting, wondering, not knowing. Those moments create tension inside of us, and the nervous system doesn't like unresolved tension. It wants an answer, any answer, because certainty feels safer than uncertainty, even when that certainty turns out to be completely wrong. And this is what I call the certainty trap. It's the moment your interpretation becomes so convincing that you just stop looking for other explanations. You stop asking yourself what else could be true, because your mind quietly concludes that it's already figured it out. And that interpretation begins to harden. And the story becomes reality. And before long, you're no longer responding to facts. You're responding to your own certainty. Now, what's fascinating is that your brain doesn't usually announce this. It doesn't tell you, hey, I'm making an assumption here. Instead, it quietly whispers, this must be what's happening. And the story arrives so quickly, it feels like an observation instead of an interpretation. And that's why people confidently say, I know they're upset with me, or I can tell they don't respect me, or it's obvious what they meant. But is it? Or has your mind simply become very certain about a story that was never fully verified? Confidence and accuracy are not the same thing. Neither are certainty and truth. This connects directly to something we talked about in the last episode. Your identity doesn't just influence what hurts you. It influences what you notice. If you've quietly believed for years that you aren't enough, your mind becomes remarkably efficient at finding evidence that supports that belief. Not because it's accurate, but because the story feels safe and familiar, even if it's inherently painful. The stories you believe the longest often become the easiest ones to believe again. Think about a simple example. Your supervisor stops by your desk and says, can you stop by my office before you leave today? That's all. No expression, no explanation, no criticism, just a simple request. Now, for the next 6 hours, your mind goes to work on that statement. Did I make a mistake? Am I in trouble? Did someone complain about me? Am I about to lose my job? You replay every conversation you've had that week, every decision, email, interaction. By the time you walk into that office, you've already lived through an imaginary future. Then your supervisor smiles and says, I wanted to thank you for how you handled that client yesterday. Notice what happened. Nothing in reality changed. Only your understanding of reality changed, yet your body experienced two completely different days. The first was built on assumption. The latter is built on truth. But the event itself didn't change. The only difference is the story did. Now, I've sat with clients who were absolutely convinced somebody was angry with them. They could describe the evidence in detail, the tone, the silence, the delayed responses. Everything seemed to confirm the story. But then, after one honest conversation, they discovered the other person had never been angry at all. The suffering they were feeling was real, but the story they were believing in simply wasn't. And that doesn't make the emotions fake. It reminds us that emotions faithfully follow the stories we believe. One of the quiet dangers of certainty is what happens next. Once your mind decides, this is what's happening to me, it begins to recruit evidence to keep that story alive. Psychologists call this confirmation bias. But you don't have to remember that name. You only need to recognize the pattern. Once your mind believes they don't appreciate me anymore, it suddenly notices every forgotten text, every distracted conversation, every missed opportunity, every small disappointment. And at the very same time, it quietly overlooks the hundreds of ordinary moments that communicate love, respect, and care. Not because those moments disappeared, but because they no longer fit the story's narrative. The interpretation becomes stronger than the reality itself. One of the most courageous things you can learn to say is, I don't know yet. Those 4 words create extraordinary emotional freedom because they allow reality time to arrive. Most people never give reality enough time. Assumptions arrive first. Reaction follows immediately. But emotionally secure people become comfortable waiting just a little bit longer. Long enough to ask, is there another explanation that I haven't considered? Now, humility plays a much bigger role here than most people realize. Humility isn't thinking less of yourself, it's accepting that your first interpretation may not be the complete one. And that's emotional maturity. It's the willingness to admit I might be missing part of the story. And that simple posture changes relationships. Because curiosity begins where certainty ends. Now, here's another sentence I hope you'll remember. The first story your mind tells is rarely the only story available. Every relationship eventually asks the same question. Will you trust your assumptions? Or will you stay curious long enough to discover the truth? And that decision quietly shapes every marriage, every friendship, every family, every conversation. Because certainty feels safe. But curiosity keeps relationships alive. Understanding this changes everything. But it still leaves one important question. If our minds naturally create stories, and our nervous system naturally seeks certainty, how do emotionally secure people learn to interrupt that process? How do they remain curious, even when every instinct is telling them to believe the first story that came into their mind? Because that's where perspective begins replacing assumption, and that's where we're going to go next. Think about the last time you were absolutely certain. Think about the last time that you were positively sure that you knew someone else's motives. You were convinced you knew why they said what they said, why they didn't respond, why they walked away, why they seemed distant. Now ask yourself something uncomfortable. Were you certain, or were you simply convinced? Those are not the same thing. One is built on evidence, the other often built on interpretation. And confusing the two has quietly damaged more relationships than most of us can realize. Now, we've talked about the meaning gap, the space between what happened and what you decided it meant. We've talked about the certainty trap, the moment your interpretation becomes so convincing that you stop looking for other explanations. Now I want to show you what emotionally secure people do differently. They don't necessarily have better instincts, they simply have better habits. More specifically, they become investigators instead of storytellers. There's a profound difference between those two ways of moving through life. Storytellers finish the story. Investigators keep asking questions. Storytellers explain people. Investigators explore people. Storytellers might defend conclusions, while investigators collect evidence. Storytellers often search for closure, while investigators search for understanding. And over time, the healthiest relationships are almost always built by investigators. Not because they know more, but because they're willing to assume less. Now imagine someone you love walks through the front door after work. They're unusually quiet. They answer your questions with one-word responses. Their mind seems somewhere else. The storyteller immediately begins writing. They're upset with me. I must have done something. They're pulling away. Within minutes, the entire evening has become emotionally framed around that interpretation, that part of the story that was written. An investigator, however, pauses. Instead of asking what's wrong with us, they quietly wonder, I wonder what's happening for them today. Same event, different question, different emotional experience, and different relationship dynamic. And this is one of the quiet superpowers of emotionally secure people. They resist the urge to assign meaning too quickly. Not because they ignore the behavior of others, but because they've learned that behavior is only one chapter of the story. Context matters, history, stress, grief matters, fatigue matters. Sometimes the person standing in front of you is carrying a burden that has absolutely nothing to do with you. And if you immediately make their behavior about you, you'll miss an opportunity to understand someone you love. Every assumption quietly steals something. It steals curiosity, patience, compassion, and most importantly, it steals trust. Because once you've decided you already know why someone did something, you stop trying to discover who they really are. And relationships slowly become conversations in between the assumptions, instead of being in between two human beings. Now, I've watched this happen countless times. A husband says, she hardly talked to me all weekend. He's convinced she's losing interest in the marriage. By Monday, he's emotionally withdrawn, frustrated. Now he's quiet. He is no longer responding to her. He's responding to the story he's been rehearsing all weekend. Now, eventually they begin talking. She wasn't withdrawing. She'd spent the weekend worrying about her mother's medical results. The distance he experienced wasn't rejection. It was anxiety. Notice what changed. Not the weekend, not her behavior, only the meaning that he attached to it. But the assumptions felt real because he'd rehearsed them often enough to believe them. One of the questions I ask clients more than almost any other is surprisingly simple. That question is, what evidence do you actually have? Not what do you feel? Feelings matter. I'm not saying they don't. All right. Not what story makes the most sense. Stories matter too. But what evidence do you actually have? That question slows the nervous system. It interrupts certainty, and it gently separates observation from interpretation. I often tell clients something that has become one of my favorite reminders. Observe first, explain second. Observe first, explain second. It sounds simple, but it changes everything. Observation asks what actually happened, what's actually occurring right now. Interpretation asks, what does this mean about me? One is looking for the reality, and the other is looking for meaning. And the problem is that we usually answer the second question before we fully answered the first. And that's where most misunderstandings begin. The goal isn't to shame yourself every time you create a story. Human minds create stories. That's what they do. Stories help us organize a complicated world. Stories help us predict and survive. So the problem isn't that your mind tells stories. The problem begins when the story becomes more convincing than the evidence. Now that's the moment to pause. Not because you've done something wrong, but because you've discovered an opportunity to be curious about those you love again. The quality of your relationships is often determined by the quality of stories you believe about the people you love. Now think about that. How many arguments began with a story? How many lonely nights started with an assumption? How many apologies were delayed because someone became certain before they became curious? The story you choose to believe will almost always shape the relationship you build. Now imagine if every important relationship in your life became just 10% more curious. Not perfect, not conflict-free, just a little slower in the assumption. Maybe a little quicker to ask, a little more willing to wonder. Now, most relationships don't change because someone learns the perfect communication technique. They change because someone finally becomes curious enough to stop assuming they already know the ending. And that's where the trust grows. That's where emotional safety begins. And that's where people stop taking everything so personally. Because one curiosity becomes stronger than certainty. Something remarkable begins to take place. You stop trying to control every conversation and you begin learning from them. And that shift doesn't just change how you communicate, it changes who you are becoming. So in the final part of today's episode, I want to leave you with one practical practice that brings everything we've discussed together. A way to move from assumptions to awareness, from interpretation to perspective, and from reaction to response. I think it's one of the most practical tools we've created for the pause and respond framework. If you've been with me through this episode, I hope you're beginning to see something that may change the way you experience every conversation from this point. Think back to where the season began. We talked about replaying conversations long after they ended. At the time, we focused on the behavior. Today, you've discovered something deeper. You weren't simply replaying the conversation. You were replaying the story. The story about what that meant. The story about what they thought of you. The story about what it said about your worth. And once you believed it, your emotions responded as though it were reality. And that realization can change everything. Because once you realize the story, you finally have the opportunity to question it. That's why emotional maturity isn't about becoming less emotional. It's about becoming more intentional. Learning to slow down long enough to ask, is this what actually happened? Or is this the story my mind created about what happened? Those are two very different questions. One leads to assumption, the other towards understanding. And that difference quietly shapes every relationship you'll ever have. Over the years, I've noticed something about emotionally secure people. They don't necessarily experience fewer emotional reactions. They simply trust fewer of their first interpretations. They've learned that their first explanation that their mind has to often is often the fastest, not necessarily the wisest. Wisdom usually arrives a few moments later, if we're patient enough to let it. That patience becomes emotional freedom. So I want to leave you with this practice. Not another complicated framework, not a list you'll forget by tomorrow morning, just 4 simple words, right? 4 words that gather everything we've talked about today into one simple rhyme. That's pause, observe, verify, and respond. You pause not because you're weak, but because your nervous system deserves time to settle. Every meaningful response begins with enough space for wisdom to arrive. Now observe, not your fear, not your assumption. Observe what actually took place, what actually happened. Separate the facts from the conclusions, reality from interpretation, because clarity begins with the observation. Now verify. This may be the most overlooked step in healthy communication. Verification means allowing reality to speak before assumption finishes the sentence. It sounds like, can you help me understand what you meant? I'm realizing I may be making some assumptions. Before I respond, can I ask you a question? Now, verification isn't weakness, it's intellectual honesty. It's choosing truth over a perceived certainty. And then finally respond, not from the story, but from the reality. Not from the prediction, but from the understanding gained through the verification. By the time you reach this step, your response is no longer being led by fear. It's being led by wisdom. And wisdom almost always sounds calmer than certainty. One of the most freeing realizations that you'll ever have is this: you are not every thought your mind produces. You are a person who decides which thoughts deserve your trust. Because most of us have lived as though every thought deserves immediate belief. Every interpretation deserves immediate action, and every emotional reaction deserves immediate expression. But those don't represent emotional maturity. Emotional maturity is recognizing that your mind can produce a thought without requiring your agreement. And that distinction changes everything. I've had clients apologize for things the other person never even noticed. I've watched people carry guilt for months over the conversations the other person barely even remembered. Not because the guilt was fake, but because the story they told themselves became so convincing, it felt more real than the relationship itself. That's the quiet power of interpretation. It doesn't have to be true to become emotionally pervasive. Imagine how much energy you've spent over the years defending yourself against stories that were never true. Imagine getting that energy back. Imagine no longer carrying imaginary arguments into your marriage. No longer replaying assumptions on your drive home. No longer allowing uncertainty to steal your peace. That's what emotional freedom feels like. Not fewer emotions, but fewer imaginary battles. Think about everything we've explored during this season. Playing conversations, repairing after reactions, words we regret, people pushing our buttons, defensiveness, taking things personally. At first, they look like completely different struggles, but underneath, they've all been pointing toward the same truth. And that's a fast mind trying to protect a vulnerable identity. That's what we've really been talking about all along. Not emotional control for its own sake, but creating enough space for your values to become louder than your fears. One day you'll look back and realize that many of the hardest battles you fought were never actually with other people. They were with stories your mind quietly wrote, long before reality had the chance to speak. And on that day, I hope you'll remember something we've discovered together. Emotional freedom begins the moment reality becomes more trustworthy than your assumptions. Because that's what emotionally secure people feel and eventually learn. Peace doesn't come from controlling other people's behavior. It comes from becoming slower to believe your first interpretation. So this week, I want you to practice one simple question. Not every hour, not every conversation. Just the next time you notice yourself writing a story about someone else's motives. Pause and ask, what else could be true? Not because your first interpretation is always wrong, but because it's almost never the only one available. That one question may save more relationships than winning 100 arguments ever could. Now, if today's episode resonated with you, I encourage you to go back and listen to the earlier episodes. You'll hear how every conversation we've had has been building towards this moment. Emotional control isn't about suppressing feelings. It's about learning to interpret your experience wisely enough that your relationships are controlled by your first reactions. And if you're ready to move beyond just listening to the podcast and begin practicing some of these skills, visit pauseandrespond.com. Pick up the Pause and Respond workbook. There's other resources. I've got the honesty advantages on there too. There's also some links on there to access some of the coaching opportunities. It's designed to help you train these habits one conversation at a time, right? This is Pause and Respond. We're not trying to think less. We're not learning to think more truthfully. We are learning to think more truthfully. We're not trying to eliminate emotion. We're learning to become wiser than our first interpretation. Because the stories your questions lose their power to control you. Until next time, less reaction, more choice.